Speakers today, we have Shaun Martin and Nikhil Advani from the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you for being with us. Shaun Martin is the Senior Director for Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience at the World Wildlife Fund and has more than 20 years of experience in capacity building, training, and leadership development. In his current role, he helps influence conservation and development policy and practice by bringing climate change and ecological dimensions to the broader adaptation and resilience discussion. He also helps WWF programs become climate smart and make sure that they are prepared to address the inevitable consequences of climate change, and their effects on biodiversity, people, and the ecosystems that they rely upon. Nikhil Advani is a Senior Program Officer for Climate Change Adaptation at the World Wildlife Fund. His primary focus is on climate change in species and human response to climate change. His species work includes conducting vulnerability assessments and developing adaptation strategies for WWF priority species, while the human response work is primarily focused on Africa and learning how communities are being affected by change in weather and climate and how they are responding. So Shaun and Nikhil are both part of the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group Climate Change Adaptation Task Team, which comprises of staff from Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the World Wildlife Fund. And they will be presenting today the findings from the ABCG pilot project that has been conducting qualitative research in select African communities on the human response to changes in weather and climate. So I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, everyone. I just realized I need to update my bio. I now have 25 years experience in capacity building and so on. Really happy to be here today, and I just want to take a show of hands. There's the Adaptation Community Forum that people get the regular invites, and then there are people who are invited through ABCG. So who here was invited through ABCG? Do we have any ABCG people? Oh, good. Okay. And well, welcome. I hope you can come to more of these adaptation talks in the future. So as Lily outlined, we are going to talk about some work today on documenting human responses to climate change, and with a specific focus in Africa, and how those responses are affecting ecosystems. And before I begin, I want to say a big thank you to USAID, not only for hosting this event and these series of events, but also for supporting the project through support through the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group. And we have Tim Resch here who made all that happen, so a big thank you to you. So to give an overview of the story arc that we're going to talk about today, climate change affects people. People respond to climate change. These responses can degrade ecosystems, and then degraded ecosystems also affect people. And that's the story arc of what the context that we're going to talk about our work in today. So I'm going to start off by showing you a video that will actually got me interested in this work, this field of documenting human responses to climate change and their impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. So this is a story from Samburu, Kenya in 2009, which during that time it was a year when both rainy seasons failed in the area. Samburu has 2 rainy seasons during a year, a long rainy season and a short rainy season. And this video was produced by BBC News after the end of the when the first rainy season that never came happened. And they're predicting if this continues to happen and we don't see the next rainy season, we're going to be in big trouble, which is actually what happened. So let's take a look at what happened in Samburu 2009.
In a drought, it's the old and the young that die first. A male elephant, perhaps just 4 and still an infant, lies in the sand in Samburu National Park, a victim of hunger in this starving landscape.
This year, the long rains totally failed. So it's desperate. It's the worst that I've seen in the last 12 years. If the rains fail in October and November, we'll go into a total crisis. I can't even imagine how awful that would be.
A few kilometers away, we found another dead elephant. This one the victim of human hunger.
Normally when they kill, they go for the tusks, but here obviously they are also coming for meat now.
For those barely alive, the search for food and water is constant and desperate. The only source of water here, wells dug by local herdsmen. If this is how it is for the elephants, it's also incredibly difficult for the people who live in this area, particularly those who are competing with the wildlife for water and grazing. And that competition for resources is creating its own life and death struggle. We found these cattle by the roadside, some dead, others dying, too weak to get back on their feet. The community reckons that 2 months without rain will finish their cattle, and for people whose existence depends on their cows, that would be catastrophic. Peter Grester, BBC News, Northern Kenya.
But this is the reality that we're facing in Africa. And so what's going on here? We have the drought where both rainy seasons failed in Samburu that year, and elephants were dying of thirst. Elephants require a lot of fresh water. And as conservationists, we often look at the direct impacts of climate change and things like severe droughts on the species that we care about, like elephants. But what I liked about this video and what I found intriguing, it was actually compounded by the fact that people's cattle were dying and they didn't have food, so they started poaching elephants for food beyond ivory. So that got me thinking, this is interesting. What else is out there? So just after this, same place, 2010, a few months later, Samburu experienced the worst flooding in its history. And I have a little video to show you what that looked like.
Hey, my name is Jamie Roberts, and this is Mario Magonga. We're Tropic Air pilots. We got a call this morning at 8:30 because the Wasanyura River, which flows through Samburu National Park, was flooded. We arrived here to find a lot of the clients that were staying in the lodges were actually sitting on the roofs trying to get away from the water. This is a small river which is normally 1 foot deep and maybe 50 meters wide in the widest part. It was now, I would say, 20 feet deep and 2 kilometers wide. What we've been doing here today, we've just been ferrying everyone from the northern end of the river to the southern end, where they've been able to get onto aircraft and fly to different destinations. Very few lodges in Samburu are now habitable.
Fall in 2 hours. And that riverbed was completely dry for a long time. And within 2 hours, it expanded to 2 kilometers wide and then went immediately back down. And now Samburu is experiencing this cycle every year. Extreme drought followed by heavy flooding. Not as severe as these two examples, but it's a recurring pattern. So what happened to the people after this flood? Well, all of the tourist lodges in the region were destroyed. And a lot of the people depended on those tourist lodges for their income. They were cooks, gardeners, tour guides, and they lost their source of livelihood. The bridge and road connecting Nairobi with Samburu was washed out, and the government didn't have any immediate plans to replace this infrastructure, so it was hard for tourists to get there, even if there were tourist lodges for them to visit. And so what happened is we saw livelihoods were lost, there was increased conflict and increased poaching in the park, which was not a problem before. People were happy to have tourists come to see the animals. Now the tourists weren't there. The animals were no longer as valuable, and people needed something to eat, so they started poaching. So just two examples of how this happened. Very different events cause pretty much the same consequence, okay, poaching. So I started digging a little bit deeper into this issue in other places, and it kept cropping up. So in 2010, the Amazon experienced its worst drought in history, and that's what the Amazon looks like in a severe drought. These people are remote. They are not connected to any other villages or sources of food except rivers. Rivers went completely dry. Fish died. They had no protein in their diet. So what did they do? They started poaching manatees that were trapped in small streams and puddles. All right? Again, drought, loss of livelihoods, turn to poaching and natural resources to cope through those severe crises. And one more example, in 2012, Assam in India had severe flooding, and there's a protected area there, and the water got too high for rhinos, so rhinos started leaving the park, and they were immediately killed. So again, we're seeing people responding to these extreme events that have negative consequences for wildlife. So we got to thinking, these stories came out of news events. They're anecdotal, but we only knew about them because the events were big enough that they were newsworthy. What is going on out there that is not newsworthy, but is still affecting people? So what we wanted to do is document some of these responses that people are having, particularly unplanned responses, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we started to put together a research plan to look at these kinds of things. How are people in rural Africa responding to extreme events and longer-term chronic change in the absence of any kind of outside assistance that they might get from USAID or other places, or formal planning? All right, and are these responses effective? Is it helping the people? And how do those responses affect ecosystems? And then what are the barriers that are keeping people to adapt to climate changes more effectively? And then finally, what we can learn from these experiences. If they're doing successful things and we're not documenting them, we need to know that to inform our conservation and development strategies. Or if they're doing things that are harmful, we need to know that to build that into our conservation and development strategies. So, as Lily mentioned, this work was done through the African Biodiversity Collaborative Group, and we have a climate change adaptation task force on that group composed of these 4 organizations, and the team members were these people. Do we have anybody from this team here? Yes. Hi, Camilla. Camilla is at CI. All right. So we have 2 kinds of responses to for adaptation to climate change: unplanned and planned. So what does this mean? And there's 2 kinds of unplanned responses. Come on. The first is what we call coping. You hear coping with climate change a lot. Some people talk as if that's a good thing. We see that as a negative thing. And coping are reactive, short-term survival strategies that in the end do not reduce the vulnerability of the people doing the coping. All right? So examples of unplanned coping response could be selling off your assets for income, where after you're back on your feet, you have nothing to live off of. Or poaching, as we saw in the examples that I showed you. And then we have autonomous adaptation, which are not quite planned, but they're a little more thought through than coping. And they're informal strategies, things that people come up with on their own that are responding to observed changes that they see with the intent of reducing their vulnerability. And so here, crop switching. So if your crops keep failing because of drought, maybe you want to switch a crop. It's not quite coping. You're taking a strategy that reduces your vulnerability, but it's really not planned. It just kind of happens, and hopefully it works out. And then we have planned responses, which are anticipatory. You're looking into the future. What kind of changes could we expect, and how can we proactively adapt to those anticipated changes as well as current changes so that we're actually reducing vulnerability? And these things take quite a bit of planning, technical assistance sometimes, financial resources, And this is what a lot of rural people lack. And so they are looking at unplanned responses. So irrigation might be an example of a planned response in situations of water scarcity. So just to get this concept through your heads, if we look at 3 reactions that are similar, coping, an example of coping might be after extreme event going to a refugee shelter. All right? Autonomous might be an individual or a family moving outside of a community to go to find a better place to live. And planned response might be relocating an entire community from a place where it's dangerous to a place that's much safer. It takes a lot more planning and assistance. In this work, we were specifically looking at unplanned responses. Why? Because we don't know what's happening because they're unplanned and they're undocumented. If they're planned and they come with technical and financial resources, there's usually some documentation and some evaluation of are they successful or not. These kinds of things are largely unexplored. So the group looked at communities in 4 countries, Gabon, Uganda, Tanzania, and Madagascar. And I will just summarize the key findings, and then Nikhil is going to take over and dig a little bit deeper into what we found when we talked to those communities. So number 1, every community we talked to is seeing changes in climate. No one said, I don't know what you're talking about. All right, and they're all being negatively affected. And all communities have responded either through coping strategies or autonomous responses. And that all communities cited barriers to more effective adaptation. They know the things that they're doing are inadequate, but what they wanted to do, there were barriers to those things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, everywhere we looked, there were negative consequences of those unplanned adaptation strategies on ecosystems. All right, so I will turn it over to Nikhil, and then we'll take questions at the end. All right, thanks.
Cool, thanks Shaun, and thank you all for coming. So I actually visited with the other countries that you saw listed on there. Gabon was, the surveys there were conducted by WCS. In Madagascar was conducted by CI, and Tanzania was conducted by TNC. And it was done by our field staff in all those countries. Uganda and Madagascar are the 2 locations that I actually visited myself and conducted these interviews. Okay, so the first site that I visited was Kyarumba in western Uganda. For those of you who know Uganda, this is close to Kasese, is the biggest town there, and it's at the foothills of the Ruwenzori Mountains. So I'll quickly show you, well actually I'll come back to this slide after I talk through some of the key findings. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of the key findings from each of the sites that I visited, and then I'll give you an overview of the key findings from our project as a whole. Okay, so in Kyarumba, there's been increased flooding, and I visited in May of last year, exactly a year before that, on Labor Day, May. Not Labor Day over here, right? That's their Labor Day is different. They had this huge flood, and it just devastated the area. So buildings were washed away. I'll go back to this slide. This, what you see over here, in the background, the bridge is still intact. In the foreground, this bridge was destroyed, and they've since rebuilt that just with a temporary bridge. And then also so this is one of the key informants who I interviewed, Teddy, and she told me that what used to be a single stream diverted into 4 different streams as a result of this flooding. So over there, you see her pointing to 2 of those streams. I didn't see the other 2, they were somewhere else. Okay, increased flooding, changing seasonality of rainfall, and this is something that we found at almost every single site that we conducted these interviews at. And also warmer temperatures. But the warmer temperatures their perception of that did vary. So in the key informant interview, she told me that they have seen warmer temperatures. In the focus group, it was a real mix. Some people said warmer temperatures, others said colder. And then they had some conversation in, I don't know if it was Luganda or whatever dialect they have there. And then they came up with a consensus. So this is actually my first exposure to doing these kinds of interviews, and maybe when we have the Q&A session we can chat a bit about this. But my impression having done this myself now, is that the key informant interviews tended to be more useful. So how have they coped or responded or adapted to these changes? One of the things that they've been advised to do is plant trees along the river's edge. And I say advised, this was actually quite a cool place to conduct an interview because they're all part of this thing called Bukonzo Joint Cooperative, which is a coffee cooperative. So they're actually getting a fair amount of advice from that organization. So they've been told to plant trees along the river's edge. A lot of the trees were washed away during the flood, and they're now planting trees as a barrier to, I guess, between themselves and the river, and also as a way to keep the soil intact and reduce soil erosion. They've been advised to move further away from the river. The site that I visited, they were advised to move anywhere from 5 to 20 meters away from the river's edge, and in another site where the flooding was even more severe, and I'm assuming had a larger floodplain, there they were advised to move 100 meters away from the river. And I don't know if people actually took that advice or not. And lastly, selection for heat. Well, I'm just presenting some of the findings. There was a lot more that came out of this. Was selection for heat-tolerant crops. I thought that was pretty cool. So they themselves are applying artificial selection. So the coffee varieties that seem to be doing better were the ones that they used for seed in the following years, and in particular in response to warming temperatures. And also, they've ever since they had the flood, I forget which organization it was, but they've installed this weather system. And this is something that there really is an increasing need for. I've been in touch with the Met Agency in Uganda, and the whole thing just seems to be a bit of a mess. They have weather stations in various parts of the country, but it's very difficult to get access to that data. If I want that data, I have to write a formal request to the executive director on paper, and who knows how long that whole process takes. So they do have some sort of a setup, but I think there's a desperate need for this kind of thing. But we need to be targeted in the places that we're doing it and make sure that the data is actually being used effectively. Okay, so that's Western Uganda. I then went to Eastern Uganda, Mabira Forest, so the closest big town to this is Jinja, and interviewed this gentleman, Mr. Sempala. So he's mostly a coffee grower and bananas. Again, changing seasonality of rainfall. And interestingly, so when you do these interviews, you can't say anything about climate change, right? You sort of start off with very broad questions. What kinds of change have you experienced? And you sort of let the key informants lead the interviews. And a lot of them, and so first of all, I'll ask them what changes they've experienced, and almost all of them said this. And then we'd pry a bit further and say, what do you attribute these changes to? And can anybody guess what the most common response was? Except you. Sorry? No, actually it wasn't. But like almost every site I went to, this was the response that I got. What's one of the biggest sort of environmental impacts that they're guilty of, I guess, themselves? Yeah, deforestation, right? So they all attributed this changing seasonality to deforestation. And actually very rarely I got climate change as a response. And that is true on a micro scale, I guess. But on a larger scale, that's not really the underlying reason for this. He's also noticed an increase in coffee and banana disease. The coffee disease, he's not sure what it is. And again, bear in mind, over here, there's always a bit of a translation issue. So sometimes I couldn't quite dig as deep as I wanted to with the questions I was asking. But he said that his coffee crops are being increasingly affected by disease, and so were the banana ones. And the banana crops he attributed to increasing temperatures, the disease that they're noticing. How is he dealing? How is he responding to this? Sterilizing cutting tools. So between the different banana crops, he would take a sickle and he would just stick it in the fire and sterilize it so as to not transmit whatever the disease was from one crop to another. And another thing which I found quite interesting was he was actually cutting off the flowers. And that was to prevent bees from transmitting anything from one plant to another. I just wish I could find out what the disease was. We couldn't quite get at that. Another thing he's done is he's switched from Arabica to Robusta, which, as the name implies, is in fact more tolerant of these changing conditions. Those of you who are coffee connoisseurs will also know that it's not quite as nice But I think in many parts of the world, we are actually seeing this. The Robusta is increasingly being grown because it's more tolerant of the conditions. And then one of the questions that we always asked the people we were interviewing is, how has wildlife in the area changed? And these two sites were probably not the most ideal for that, because they were, I think to actually really get at that question, you have to be in or very close to a national park. In this case, he just said that there was less wildlife in general. Typically, they refer to monkeys, snakes, and birds. And he said he attributed that to the lack of trees. So that was Uganda. And then Madagascar. So Madagascar, I went to this remote village in the southwest of Madagascar. One of them was Behelok, and the other one was Marofijeri. It's quite interesting. We had to take a plane, boat, and car to get there. So, okay, and these are just, on the top left is one of the coastal villages, which was a fishing village. Below that is the focus group that I interviewed in that village, and that's one of the key informants that I interviewed. So the key findings here, what changes are they seeing? They all reported more frequent and intense cyclones. Some of them said that these cyclones used to happen only once or twice a year, and now they're occurring once a month. And some of them also said that the rain is only really coming during the cyclones. So when they used to get, fairly regular rainfall, nowadays it only comes when there's a cyclone. Changing seasonality of rainfall, again. And also poor crop harvest. So this was more applicable to the farming villages. So over here I did 2 interviews in the coastal village, and the other 2, which is not very far, it was probably about a kilometer or 2 inland, but those were all farmers, or at least they always used to be farmers. And they complained of a poor crop harvest. So how have people responded to these changes? This was a really interesting response that I got. Both the fishing village and the inland villages said that they had, as a result of this, poor crop harvests, that they were now turning to fishing instead as a way to sustain themselves and also to get some income. But the inland villagers claimed that, they were conducting their fishing practices in a proper way, and they were actually doing it in a different site, so there was no conflict between them and the traditional fishing communities. But then the fishing communities told me that, and this was in both the focus group and the key informant, that these people are coming in and that they don't know how to fish. So they're basically just improvising as they do it. And in some cases, it's actually really destructive. So one of the really interesting things that I was told was they'll be chasing like an octopus, and the octopus will go and hide inside the reef. And these guys will take out a spear and just hack away at the reef to get at the octopus. And the people who live in the fishing villages know not to do that. So that's one of the really interesting things we're trying to get at with this whole project, is how are these human responses to climate change impacting on biodiversity. Harvesting wild plants, this again was more true of the village that's inland. So their crops are failing and they're turning to muki. Does anybody know what that is? It's kind of a root, and I think someone described it to me as being similar to cassava. So they've been harvesting that, cactus fruit, which is actually quite delicious. I got to try that. But again, something like cactus fruit, one of the people was telling me that it is tasty, but you can only eat so much of it. And actually, it can be quite bad for your stomach because it's something to do with the seeds and you have to spit them out. But she said that it's been a bit of a problem because some people really only had this to eat at some times of the year. And this is the only thing they were sustaining themselves on. And then from some of the work that CI did, also in Madagascar, they found that people were catching hedgehogs for meat. And then this was also interesting, that the wildlife, these are people who've, a lot of them have been there their whole life, and they told me that there's a lot less wildlife in marine life in the sea than there used to be. So sharks used to be fairly common around the coastline. They don't see them unless they go a lot into much deeper waters. There used to be turtles nesting on the beach. They don't see that anymore either. And again, there's the impact on coral reefs, which I already mentioned. Yeah, damage to corals. Okay. So what are some of the so this is actually this is looking at the findings from all the 4 organizations now. But this is just a bit of a summary, and if you look at our report that we have, this is all contained within that report. So the reactive responses, what Shaun referred to as unplanned responses, gathering wild plants and animals, selling assets. So and these are just, again, just some of the key findings. There's a lot more than this. Reactive responses, what we might call adaptation strategies, conservation, agriculture, and land management. So in many cases, we're seeing them using techniques like mulching, planting shade cover, switching farming locations to different parts, and also just planting trees. Changing farming practices. So here we're seeing changing farming practices, what I already mentioned with the artificial selection with coffee, which was quite cool. So they're actually, selecting varieties themselves, which are more tolerant, and also switching from Arabica to Robusta. And also in other cases, they're just changing what they grow, right? So they're switching to different crops. And in another project, which is somewhat related to this, a lot of what we're hearing of is switching to short season variety crops, because the rains have become so unpredictable that by going for the short season variety crops, they can just cram it into a shorter growing period. So one of the responses that I got in Madagascar was that rather than that village that said that they have a poor crop harvest, rather than the one really good annual harvest that they used to get, they now instead have 2 to 3 pretty poor harvests. Livelihood diversification. So this is, rather than traditional farming or hunting, they're now, one of the examples was gathering wild plants and animals from the forest. And in other cases, they're also just changing livelihoods altogether and actually turning to selling things. In Uganda, we've seen that as an example. And also migration, typically amongst the younger folk towards bigger cities. Some of the planned adaptations that we've seen, improved technology, a lot of that had to do with irrigation systems, and subsidies as well from local governments. And finally, anticipatory adaptation, weather forecasts, and early warning systems. So in some cases, I think at least in Madagascar and in Uganda, they had access to weather forecasts over the radio. Some of the barriers to adaptation, again, this is stuff that a lot of you who work in adaptation are probably very familiar with. Lack of access to finance and credit, lack of access to information and technical know-how, and land tenure. And on that note, sort of just thinking about what we can actually do, because that's an obvious next step of this project, it is really important to think about making, in particular that second point, lack of access to information and technical know-how. We have so much data on things like climate projections and weather and, which are appropriate crop varieties to use. But it's really important for us to actually make this accessible to these communities. So one very cool example, which I haven't seen the actual tool itself, but I was told about when I was in Uganda, is this group that's got this 7-step process where they want researchers to take, say, a peer-reviewed publication that they've worked on, and go through this process and actually digest all of that information into a message so small that it could be communicated via SMS. Now, that's obviously not, a lot of the stuff that's contained in those publications is going to be useless to these local communities in any case, but it's just a cool idea of how we can actually make this information accessible. Okay, so what are some of the challenges we see? These are some of the things that we really need to start thinking about now. How can we help people in ways that actually help ecosystems rather than harm ecosystems? So that's really one of the key questions we were trying to get at over here, is how are people responding to these changes and how are those responses impacting biodiversity? So at this stage, I think it's very much a learning process. It's something that we, if you're looking at impacts on species, for example, we've done all these modeling studies, we've done all these assessments, but we're increasingly realizing that species are actually already being impacted by human responses. And that actually might be the most important thing. So this is something we really need to explore more. Number 2, people in the same communities can perceive changes differently, and that was very true. So that, in particular, in those focus groups is where that really came out, where some people would say, yeah, it's got warmer, others would say, no, it's got cooler. I think rainfall tended to be more, they tended to have more of a similar response with rainfall, but temperature in particular varied. And lastly, how do we incorporate traditional knowledge? So that too, in the IPCC's most recent report last year, they've identified use of indigenous knowledge as a key resource that we know very little about. So how can we learn more about what people are already doing in the field, and how can we begin to incorporate that? Again, a lot of it is going to be very context specific, but that too is one of the major aims of this project. Okay, so what's next? Well, this is somewhat on hold pending further funding from USAID, and we're hoping that that would come through for the next 5 years. So we really do want to scale up this project. And I will say that this first year, I really think that ABCG is a fantastic group. There's 4 organizations listed over there. For this next proposed project, there's going to be 7 of us. So Jane Goodall, African Wildlife Foundation, and World Resources Institute will be joining. Just to give you an idea of how this work was conducted, on a very small budget, this was for the 2014 fiscal year, the 4 organizations managed to do all of this work. Am I allowed to say what the budget was? Yeah? Okay. I think it was only about $70,000. But all 4 organizations for a year, and it just shows you the power of working together, right? All these conservation organizations, we all have different strengths, and in Africa, we have stronger offices in different countries. So that's an easy way for us to spread our reach. And I just think it's amazing how much work we were able to accomplish with such a small amount of money in such a small amount of time as well. So we're looking to scale up to many more locations throughout Africa. Hopefully get a lot of learning from this to influence policy and practice. And then also, raise awareness and I think most importantly, implement solutions. So when I was conducting these interviews, in many cases as I was leaving, I was asked, okay, so what are we going to get out of this? And that's a very valid question, right? These are very good people who devoted an hour or 2 if they did to talk to me. And I really think, at least as a starting point in the communities where we're gathering data, hopefully we can go back and actually start implementing some of the best practices that we're learning from all this work. And that is it. So hopefully we have some good time for questions and answers.
So, do we have any questions? And if they're easy questions, I'll take them. If they're hard questions, Nikhil will be happy to answer them. So, yes, ma'am. And use the microphone, and please identify yourself and where you're from.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Oh, Giselle McAuliffe. I am a communications consultant who works with international environmental and development organizations. And so my question is, where is your development organization partner? Because especially when you tell me your budget, and I think of the international development groups I work with, this is just something that they would be very interested in.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy
and
one.
I mean, really, there's the, I mean, the environment is one thing, but this is really all about people's
right.
livelihoods and their ability to survive this,
So,
this
very good
climate
question.
change
So ABCG is a collaborative group of conservation organizations. We do dabble in development because we realize that meeting people's needs helps conservation. But we did not have a development partner for this, and partly because ABCG isn't structured that way, and the budget limitations didn't really allow us to spread the money any thinner. As we scale up the work, we intend to really involve the development community so that we can share these findings. One of the things that I hope to get out of this research, and I think we're doing that, is to inform conservation organizations that you need to think about people a lot more. Who would have thought if you want to protect coral reefs, you have to help farmers inland? But that's what we're finding out. And so we can't necessarily have all the solutions to help farmers inland, but we need to find the right partners that can help us do that. So yes, the intention is to make this a broad partnership, coalition between development and conservation organizations.
I also think it's a critical source of funding, much more significant funding than you're talking about here.
Oh, you know it.
So,
We're aware of that.
Why not have them in the center? Why not have them be the biggest?
And again, it's because of the budget limitations we had in this final year of our 5-year contract. and we just went with what we had. And this is really a pilot. Is there a there? I started off by saying we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from news stories. None of these events that these people experienced made the news, but they're equally impactful. And we need to scale up the research in many more locations so we can start looking for patterns that we can actually use to inform policy and practice with USAID and development organizations as well as conservation organizations.
Sure.
Hard question?
John Magistro, Department of Interior. Akil, it's Akil?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the Uganda work. So I was part of the the Uganda study vulnerability assessment carried out under ARC, aid funded for the USAID mission, and I was actually in Kasese, so I was quite close to where you were. One of the observations there, and we saw one of the observations there, and also a few other sites, was that in highland areas where people were cultivating, where they had both highland and lowland areas, they were shifting more from highland more to lowland, particularly wetland and swamp areas, because of the heat stress, the higher altitudes, and lower productivity of the crop. So they were moving downward into the wetland areas, and this was a fairly salient observation. It was coming up frequently in the responses in focus groups. They in the lower lying wetland areas, they were cultivating more and putting more stress in those areas. And in particular, they were doing a lot more cutting, both for fuel wood and the kilns, fire kilns for making bricks. There was a lot of that going on too. And so I just wondered if you observed that or not. It was sort of a maladaptive kind of thing going on in low-lying areas.
Yeah, I actually forget what elevation this was at, but I didn't notice that. I didn't get any responses related to like elevational shifts in their practices. And again, I think that was maybe limited by the questions that I was asking them. And in many cases, like I said, I sort of just let them lead the interview and collected whatever data they gave me. So I didn't see anything like that in terms of a shift in elevation. And as far as other maladaptive practices, I mean, deforestation's everywhere. Yeah, they're for charcoal. I think that WWF actually is working in that area and giving them some, I think it was solar-powered cook stoves. So there are some initiatives like that ongoing over there. One interesting thing is that which I forgot to say, is that the Ruwenzoris, so this is in the foothills of the Ruwenzoris, and a lot of what we're seeing is this runoff from there. They're projected to be ice-free by 2023. So within less than a decade. That's the last that I heard. So that is huge for these people. And I don't know how that's impacting where they're choosing to farm in terms of like elevation or distance from the river. Yeah.
She's asking if you can elaborate on the reason why you discounted their understanding that deforestation is a reason for changes.
Okay, that's a good question. Well, so like I said, a lot of them attributed these changes to deforestation. I'm no climate genius, and I only know a limited amount about this, but cutting down trees in a particular area could have an effect on the microclimate in that area. But in a larger scheme of things, if you're seeing prolonged drought in Kenya, for example, which they had for quite a few years, that's not due to just deforestation. That's actually probably a very small fraction of that. There's many factors contributing to water scarcity, and actually there's an increasing body of literature that's saying that in Africa, a lot of the changes we're seeing might not actually be due. Obviously, nothing is going to be solely due to long-term climatic changes, but a lot of it might be due to increased water usage and changing farming practices and things like that. So yeah.
I don't think we were discounting the fact that deforestation contributes to local change. It was more interesting for us that no one cited climate change as a potential reason for the changes that they're seeing. It was always due to deforestation. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have an observation to share, if I may.
Please.
From a business perspective.
my company produces hydroelectric power without dams. We use water currents in rivers. It also provides irrigation pumping, and we're also on a project pumping water up out of Zambezi gorges for watering holes for a new elephant preserve. Involves 5 African countries. That's all on the planning stage, if you will. But this is what I wanted to share with everybody from a business point of view. What needs to happen here to answer the question on economics is there has to be a private-public partnership formed here along with coalitions, because all of the problems really get down to money. And so when we do ecosystem benefit analysis, it needs to be ecosystem cost-benefit analysis. And so here's what we're doing. I also on a committee at the Department of Commerce on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And what we're doing is this idea of what we call regional integrated resource planning with the water, energy, food nexus in mind, working with UN entities. And the idea is to go into any area, any kind of community on develop sustainability. So the idea is to examine all of the local clean indigenous resources, wind, solar, geothermal, waste to energy, hydrokinetic power, how they're all stitched together to create base load power to provide energy for a community. But at the same time, what's involving is husbanding of water, irrigation, pumping. That calls for master planning. From the kind of research that you're doing, which I think is wonderful to be factored in, but then who is doing the overall planning? And so the answer is nobody is doing regional integrated resource planning. This is what needs to be done. So what we're talking about at the Department of Commerce and with UN entities is to create this new kind of planning process, given the kind of information that you're collecting. So the important part about USAID bringing this money forward is for that very reason, so we can begin to focus on it. So I just want to share that observation with you, and at the same time sort of throw it out to everybody in the room about who becomes part of this coalition to get at this planning process, which is really key, and to do it quickly, because climate change is here. It's not going to happen. It is here, and we've got, what, until about 2050 to keep 2 degrees centigrade from getting there?
We don't want to debate that, but
yeah.
I would say we don't have even that long.
Okay, very good. I would agree with you.
Well, that and also the 2 degrees is just an arbitrary target. It really doesn't mean a whole lot.
Well, what's at stake here is really Homo sapien.
And actually, I don't know if I mentioned that, but one of the barriers to adaptation that a lot of them cited was energy access.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to make that comment, and that's why I'm here, is to see if we can't gather more to be part of this coalition, of this private-public partnership to be created.
Great. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm Jean-Louis Safari. I am from the DRC, just a concerned citizen. I was wondering whether you shared the findings with the governments in these places, and what responses did you get, and how do you feel their preparedness to these events? If you could share that with us.
Yeah, sure. I think definitely so this is very much the pilot stage of this project, and as we scale up in the coming years, if we will obviously be working with the governments in those countries. The interactions that I've had so far have actually been pretty positive. In Uganda, I don't think it's not a dedicated ministry, but within one of the ministries, they actually have a dedicated climate change division now. Same thing in Kenya. So these countries are becoming very serious about this. And in Uganda, the group I've been working with is Makerere University Climate Change Research and Innovation. So, and those, for me, are sort of my go-betweens between the work that we're doing and the government, because they have regular access to the Ministry of Environment and people like that. So definitely, I mean, we will, even for the weather stations, those are the kinds of things you absolutely have to work with the government for. Yeah. But it's a challenge, as you know, right? Living in those countries, it's not always easy. Yeah, and they're all, I mean, a lot of them are coming up with their adaptation plans. And also now with this year, with the GCF, the Green Climate Fund coming on board, that's going to make available a lot of funding, right? There's an initial pot of about $10 billion. It could go up to as much as $100 billion. This is all money that's being made available to developing countries. And I think the intended mix is 50-50 between mitigation and adaptation. So what a lot of projects like this will hope to influence is that the funds that are coming from the GCF are actually going to be used in an appropriate way. Yeah.
We have a question from Judith Dalinger. She says, it's been highlighted that access to funding was a key problem. Where does a lack of funding have the most profound impact in your view? Agriculture, small farmers, public services, others? What type of access to capital do you think would help most?
That was really hard question that neither of us are prepared to answer, but we'll take a stab at it.
Well, I will just add that a lot of that was actually from the literature, that particular finding. Yeah.
So we spoke to mostly agricultural communities, and as Nikhil mentioned, a fishing community. We didn't talk to pastoral communities, as if I recall correct, not in Tanzania.
Maybe in Tanzania.
So the barriers are when you talk to the people, the barriers and where it would be impactful, we don't have enough data to say yet, because everyone says what would be impactful for them and their livelihood. And so it's, we have very few data points to say, if you want to make the biggest impact, put it here or put it there. But universally, everyone is talking about if we had a little more money, or sometimes a lot more money, we could actually adapt much more effectively and perhaps reduce the impact on, reduce some of the reactive coping strategies that are putting so much more stress onto ecosystems. Agriculture is probably the biggie, though, I would say. Everyone needs food, and people are losing food, and that's where they're reacting the most. And so there's a lot of emphasis now on climate smart agriculture. We keep hearing that more and more, and I think that will be a recurring theme far into the future. And then the other thing is water access, and then we've already talked about energy access. So if we have those three things and they're done appropriately, we can hopefully help people adapt without undermining the natural resource base, but actually try to maintain it, even as ecosystems themselves are directly affected by climate change. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had one question. I thought your comment about everybody having a different perspective, everybody who lives in the same place sees what's before them in a very different way. I want to see what your thoughts are further on that, because, I think it's almost a human condition in a way. If we look at a car accident and we interview 10 of us, I think we get 10 different perspectives. I mean, we see the accident, but we don't see it in the same way.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy.
And I'm not sure it may be synonymous, but I think it's pervasive. It's who we are.
Right. So I would say that we need to dig into this a little deeper, but I would say initially people see differences. Everyone's not experiencing the same things. The same thing is happening to everybody, but we experience it in different ways. So the people who are saying temperatures are getting hotter are probably noticing that the hotter temperatures are destroying their livelihoods, while the people saying it's cooler, the cooler temperatures are affecting their livelihoods. So that sticks in their mind. The other thing is people will say it's getting a lot wetter because last year they had a flood, but there might have been 10 years of drought before that. So the last thing that affected them tends to be the freshest thing in their memory. And so you get these conflicting ideas. Even if people are on the same page, that perceived changes often conflicts with actual observed changes, from weather data. And then it's a perception issue. People are reacting to what's infecting them, not what they're actually seeing. And so we need to look at that much more carefully. The challenge for planning is, if you have a community and some people are saying it's less rain and others saying more rain, how do you come to consensus on what the solution should be?
What happened when you got those groups and they spoke another language and then they gave you...
I'll turn that over to this guy because I wasn't there personally.
Well, I'll quickly just add to that the previous question. And I think one thing that I found, which would make sense, is that when you're asking them for their perception of change, looking at extreme weather events was a lot easier than longer term changes. And I find that to be true of myself. I lived in Austin for 15 years, and if people ask me, did it get hotter in the time that you lived there, I don't really have a good gauge of that. you know, over the long term. But I remember that 2008 was a really wet summer. I remember that another summer was a really hot summer. And that's what we found in these communities. So the flood, they all unanimously said, yeah, there was this massive flood. But in terms of longer term changes, it's always harder to get at that question. Sorry.
Well, again, when you had spoken earlier, you said that some said it was hotter, some said it was colder. Then there was a conversation in a language which you didn't understand, and some consensus then came forward from that. What was the consensus?
Well, I think in that case, it was that it had got warmer. Yeah, so that was the focus group in Uganda. And actually, in Uganda, because in Uganda people actually speak, a lot of people do speak English. The key informant interview I conducted in English, the focus group was in English, but then when this whole thing of longer term changes came up, that's when they started discussing in Luganda, I think. And then they came up with that answer. Because that's the other thing, is they almost feel like they have to give a unanimous answer to the question, when in fact that's not really the case. So I don't know if people have experience with that, but I personally found that the key informant interviews were a lot more useful than the focus group, just because we're trying to get at such detailed, we're not looking to get a mass of data, right? If we wanted to do that, we would just do household surveys. Here we're looking to really dig deep in a few key issues.
I also want to point to a really interesting, the whole issue of language. I've done training on adaptation and climate change in many, many contexts, in many countries where English is not the first language. I was in Cambodia once and we had simultaneous interpreters, and I'm talking about the difference between climate and weather, and the interpreter stops and wait a minute, those are the same word in Khmer. So conceptually, they don't have a frame to talk about some of the things that we're talking about. And the reason they don't have a distinction, because they said the weather never changes. It's always hot. It's either drier or wetter, but it's not variable like we have in temperate climates where you need descriptions for minute temperature and weather changes. So the issue of language is really, really something we need to pay a lot more attention to. Maybe there are two more questions, I think. Anita?
Yeah, Anita Van Breda, World Wildlife Fund. I was just wondering, what's the total number of participants in this project? So how many key informant interviews across all the countries, and how many focus groups, and the number of participants in them?
I can tell you when we get back to the office.
Actually, no, but that's a good, I do have the report here, and I'll look it up.
Is it like 10, 100?
The sample size is pretty small because of our budget limitations, so that's why we need to scale up the work, because you can't really draw any patterns from this work. They're just more anecdotes.
I think the total was about 30 interviews or so. There were 30 to 40 interviews that were conducted, yeah, but including focus groups. Yeah. Tim?
I thought this was the point that Anita was going to make. It was a conversation about the linkages with development agencies, but also on the, kind of what can money do. An important part of that is relief. Is that during these extreme events, flooding, drought, refugee situations, man-caused or naturally caused, good disaster assistance relief activities can play a key role in kind of protecting the ecosystem, providing plastic tarp over letting people build wood branch huts, alternate foods over poaching and wild plants and such. So a third leg of that response to climate change, kind of the role of donors or communities, is timely, effective relief activities that might mitigate some of the negative environmental harm that could be caused if the victims were left to their own means.
Right. You're right. That's something that Anita would have said. Surprised she didn't. That's yeah. I hear it all the time. Anita Van Breda here works on our team at WWF and with a focus on disasters and how disasters can impact the environment. Sort of some of the same observations we made here, but on much larger scales, and how the relief efforts can actually contribute to environmental degradation, which actually exacerbate vulnerability for future disasters. And that's what you're referring to. And that can be a whole nother discussion for another one of these meetings at some time. Yes?
Mike Cody is asking, he says he's curious about how you define barriers. For example, what is a barrier to finance and credit? Who exactly lacks access to finance and credit?
A barrier is something that prevents you from doing something that you want. I don't think we've thought of it more than that. There are institutional barriers, knowledge barriers, structural barriers, many things that kind of trap people in their situations that they can't get out of. So it's just a loose concept, but anything that's really preventing you from taking action to improve your situation. So I don't have a better answer than that, unless someone else wants to offer. Yeah. Okay. No more questions, which is fine. We have cookies, I believe. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Great questions, and we're very encouraged by the great questions that we got and the kind of discussion we had. As Nikhil mentioned, we hope to scale up this work very soon, and maybe in a year or two we can come back with lots more data and lots more